Continue now at the top of Daf Yomi Gemara in Meseches Sotah. This is Sotah Daf 5b. The Gemara continues a statement from Rav Ashi on the previous Amud that anyone who's arrogant will be diminished, and we learn this out from the pasuk by Tzaras, Velasa Eis, Velasa Pachas, talking about different kinds of negoim, and we understand the pasuk, we darshan the pasuk to mean Ve'ein Se'eis El Lashon Gavoa. The word Se'eis can refer to highness or haughtiness, arrogance. Shenema, like it says, Ve'al Kol HaHorim HaRamim Ve'al Kol HaGavos HaNisos. So that's the language of Nisos, like Se'eis. It means high up. Ve'ein Sapachas El Atfeila. And the word Sapachas, that can be a reference to something that's an appendage, something that's just added on, it's diminished. Shenemar, like the pasuk says, and there's the pasuk in Shmuel, the pasuk says, Sefacheni no alachas hakohunos lechol pas lechem. You should add me on, again, like an appendage, add me on to one of the families of kahuna so that I can get a small amount of bread. So again, you see this idea of v'lasapachas. The person who is arrogant is going to be v'lasapachas. He's going to be diminished. And the Gemara continues. Amar Rav Yehoshua ben Levi borei kama gedolim nemuche haruach lefnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Rav Yehoshua ben Levi says, "Come and see how great are those who are humble before HaKadosh Baruch Hu." Because at the time that there was a Beis HaMikdash, if someone would bring an ola, he'd get the reward for a carbon ola. If he brought a mincha, he'd get the reward for a carbon mincha. But somebody who is humble, the pasuk considers it as if he brought all of the karbonos. Shenemar, like the pasuk says, there's a pasuk in Tehillim, Zivchei Elokim Ruach Nishbar. It says, like all the karbonos of Hashem is the broken spirit, the person who is humble. V'lo od, and not only that, such a person, his tefillah is not despised. Shenemar, like the pasuk says, this again is the same pasuk. It says, Leiv nishbar v'nidke elokim lo sivzeh. Again, the broken heart, the person who is humble. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu does not despise such a person. And the Gemara continues, V'amar Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, and Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi says, Kol hasham or chosav ba'olam hazeh, anyone who carefully considers his ways in this world, Zoch Rabbi Yehoshua, so shall HaKadosh Baruch Hu will merit to see the salvation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Shenemar, like the pasuk says, V'sam derech erenu b'yesha elokim. It means somebody who orders his ways. This is a pasuk from Tehillim. So I will show him the salvation of God. But we darshan, it's not v'sam derech. I'll take away v'sam ela v'sham derech. We can darshan it that it means somebody who evaluates, somebody who considers his actions. Such a person, I will show him the salvation of God. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Ketzad mekani la v'chula. What is the process? How does he warn her? And the Gemara says, Hagufa kasha. The Mishnah's wording itself is internally contradictory. Amrit amar lo b'fnei shnayim al tadabri mish ploni zeh. The Mishnah says like this. Let's say he says to her in front of two people, don't speak with so-and-so. Almud dibor stirahu. You see that speaking, that's considered seclusion. V'hadar tani, but then the Mishnah goes and says, Dibra imo adayin muteris levesu muteris lechol b'truma. That if she speaks with him, so that's not really seclusion. She's still mutter to her husband. She's still mutter to eat truma. Alma dibor lo klumu. You see that speaking is really nothing. So is speaking considered seclusion if she speaks to that man, or is it not considered seclusion? Amar Abaye says hachi kamar. Here's the way to understand the Mishnah. Al tadabri v'dibra, if he says don't speak and she speaks with him, or al tadabri v'nistra, or even if he says don't speak with him and she goes into seclusion, in both of those situations it's not a problem. Al tistri v'dibra imo, if he says don't go into seclusion with that man and she speaks with him, also not a problem. Adayin muteris levesu muteris lechol b'truma. She's still mutter to her husband and she can still eat truma. But nichnasa imo leves haseiser, if he says don't go into seclusion and she goes into seclusion with that man, b'shoas hakadei tum, and she stays with him the amount of time it takes for defilement, in that case asura levesa v'asura lechol b'truma. Then she's forbidden to her husband and she's forbidden from eating truma. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, via meis choletzes, and if her husband dies, so then she does chalitza and she does not do yibum. It's talking about a case where a wife is warned not to go into seclusion with another man, and she goes into seclusion with that man. At that point in time, her husband dies, so she doesn't do yibum, she does chalitza. And the Gemara asks, Amai, why is that the case? Tesiyavim nami yevume. Why can't she do yibum? It has not been proven that she committed adultery. Why is it that she has to do chalitza? Amar Rav Yosef says, Amar Krutz, because the pasuk says, V'yotza mi beiso v'olcha v'aisel ishacher. It's a gzeres hakasav. The pasuk talks about a woman who gets divorced, and it says she marries ishacher, a different man. L'ishacher v'lo l'yavam. We understand that to mean she marries a different man, but not the yavam, not the brother-in-law. Rashi explains, V'yotza mi beiso le'el min eksiv ki matza bo'er vas davar v'gomer. earlier in the pasuk, it's talking about divorce. It's talking about the reason why he's divorcing her is because there's some suspicion of arayis, which is exactly our case over here, where she went into seclusion with this other man. So the Gemara is saying, why does it have to say li'ishachar she marries another man in this case where she's suspected of adultery? If it's just saying that she's allowed to marry through a get, so lichtov v'yatzmi beisov v'haisalish, it should just say v'yatzmi beisov v'haisalish. Lama li lemichtav la'acher. Why does it have to say the word li'ish acher? Ela lemu'ute yevama. So what it's saying is, it's excluding the brother-in-law. Heicha delo garsha bal acher shemotza ba'er vastavar. We're talking about a case where the husband did not actually divorce her, even though he has some suspicion of adultery, but he didn't divorce her. That's the case really that the pasuk is talking about. V'hachi mishtami kroi, and that's what the pasuk is saying. Ki motza ba'er vastavar yigreshena b'sefer krisus v'yatzmi beso. If he finds a suspicion of arayis, so then he should divorce her and she leaves his house. Kolomar v'cholot tzad shetetzimi beso, and what the pasuk means to say is, however she leaves his house, bein al yedei gerushin, bein al yedei misa, whether she is divorced from him or whether he ends up dying, in basali nasi li'shachar, if she wants to go ahead and marry someone else, tinasi, she can marry someone else. V'lo liyavam, but she can't marry the yavam at that point in time, regardless whether she got a get or whether he died. She cannot marry the yavam. She'eno acher etzel nisuin shel zu shemikoach nisuei rishon hinis kekeslo. That's not called acher. That's not another person, because when you do yibum, that's really like a continuation of that original, that first marriage, and therefore that's what the pasuk is saying, that yibum is not allowed. It's essentially a gzeres hakosiv, that in this case yibum is not allowed. So Amar le Abaye, so Abaye said to Rav Yosef, Elameat, according to that, if there's a gzeres hakosiv over here, that there's no yibum, so chalitza nami lo tiboy, so then she shouldn't require chalitza. Why does the Mishnah say that she needs chalitza? That's exactly what the pasuk is saying. The pasuk is saying that in a situation where there's a suspicion of arayis, the pasuk says she then becomes permitted to somebody else, no matter how she leaves the first husband, whether it's through a divorce or whether it's when he dies, and so there's no need for yibum whatsoever, and therefore there should be no need for chalitza. So Amar Lei, so Rav Yosef said back to Abaya, Ilu Isei Labal, if the husband was still around, so Milo Boy get, so certainly a get would be needed. So Hashtanami Tiboy Chalitza, that's why now in this case as well, Chalitza is needed. And Rashi says, Ilu Isei Labal, mi mishtarya below get. Let's say the husband was alive. Would she be permitted without a get? Haksiv, v'chasav lasei for krisus. We know, of course, she needs a get. Afilim atzaboyer vasdover. Even if you have a situation where a woman is suspected of arayas, krisus boy, there still is a requirement for a get krisus. So hashdan hami, so now also, boin chalitza the yavam b'makom balkoi. She's going to need chalitza because the yavam is like a continuation of the marriage of the husband. He stands in the place of the husband, and therefore, just like, even though it's a suspicion of arayas, but just like if the husband was alive, she would require a get, so to over here by the yavam, she requires chalitza. And the Gemara continues, V'ista amri, now some have the version as follows. Rashi over here says, this the Amri, the Hachi Shani Rav Yosef Le'el, Rachmona Omar Tziva Lebal Legarsha Mibeso, Kishamatza Bo Ervas Davar. Rav Yosef's answer to Abaye was, the Torah says that if you have a suspicion of arayas, the husband's supposed to divorce her. And the reason for the divorce in this version of Rav Yosef is so that she doesn't destroy his household. Like we said earlier, we said that when you have znus in the household, so that is like that's a destructive force, like a worm in sesame. And so that's what Rav Yosef was answering. Amar Rav Yosef now says, the Torah says that she should leave his house and she should marry someone else, and that way she won't destroy his household. Going on the original question of the Gemara, and you're saying that she should do yibum. Of course there can't be yibum over here. Why would we say that if her husband dies in a case of suspected arayas where really the husband is supposed to divorce her, but then it happens to be he dies, why would we say that she does yibum? So Amar le Abaye, so to that answer, in this version, to that answer, Abaye says to Rav Yosef, Elamiat, according to that, La'acher lo tinasi de lo sister lebese. She shouldn't marry anyone. She should not marry anyone else either, so that she shouldn't destroy that person's household. Amar le, so he said back to him, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Vav Amud Aleph.